Welcome. I'm glad you could join us today for the first of 7 short video devotionals through Lent. Today is Ash Wednesday, and so a video will come out each Wednesday as we get to Easter. Because we just finished February, which is Black History Month, I wanted to talk about someone who I greatly admire. Bryan Stevenson is a best-selling author, extraordinary attorney, seeker of justice, and a follower of Jesus. It's best if you just read his story in his own words from his book, Just Mercy. Or if you don't like to read, you can check out the movie by the same title. It's a powerful, mercy-filled story about Bryan's experiences and wisdom as a black man and as a lawyer advocating for the oppressed in the midst of severe injustice and inequality right here in the United States. His life and book shed light on the egregious 1980s and 90s era of the criminal justice system that he elaborates thoroughly in Just Mercy. But let me just give you a brief summary to give you a little context on the suffering and the injustice that Bryan gets close to. There's a tragic formula of the American prison system, which has been extreme punishment for those with minor offenses. And the tragic consequence of that formula was mass incarceration, primarily of African Americans, which created a family breakdown in their family units and a lot of wrongful death sentences that included children and people with mental health severities. And so bearing those incredibly spiritual, social, and judicial wrongdoings, how did this young, at the time, black, Harvard-graduated lawyer from Milton, Delaware, respond to these realities? In 1989, he founded the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, the EJI. And by the way, their offices are now located near the landing at the Alabama River, where enslaved peoples used to be literally unloaded in the domestic slave trade, and near the Court Square in Montgomery, which historically has been considered one of the largest enslaved people's auction sites in the country. Bryan articulates the mission of EJI in his book, most notably through his most famous defense of the wrongfully accused Walter McMillan, whose controversial case involved Walter, an innocent black man, wrongfully sentenced to death for the murder of a white woman. Walter's case became a national bookmark in the American justice system for decades to come. And I'll leave you to read the book or watch the movie, not just to find out what happens to Walter, but to feel the heart and mercy of God through Bryan's life story. As of 2019, his nonprofit that he started, the Equal Justice Initiative, has saved 125 people from the death penalty and helped countless others in the process of wrongful convictions and just defending basic racial and economic human rights in the heart of Montgomery, Alabama. Now, bearing all of that in mind, I wanted to offer some insight into the wisdom and godly convictions behind the power and history-making of EJI's founder, Bryan Stevenson. First and foremost, one doesn't have to follow his work long to realize that this man is proximate to suffering, just like Jesus was and is. When Bryan was around 16 years old, he was already close to suffering and the reality of it. By 16, he was already familiar with the dehumanizing legacy of racism, racial segregation, and poverty in his experience. And he was also born and raised into a rich faith heritage, growing up in the Prospect American Methodist Episcopal Church, where he was exposed to the lives of faithful Jesus followers. And it was also where he learned, through the stories of his church, that in his words, quote, "The more you had fallen in our church, the more you were celebrated for standing up." I love that quote. Another reality of his suffering is when his maternal grandfather, Clarence Golden, was murdered in his home during a robbery. And in response to the murder of his grandfather, Bryan said, quote, "Because my grandfather was older, his murder seemed particularly cruel. but I came from a world where we valued redemption over revenge. As I hope you're beginning to see and feel, this man became wise through his proximity to suffering. So much so that his recurring counsel to people is to become willing to come close to suffering. In his own words, if you are willing to come closer to people who are suffering, you will find the power to change the world. One more quote from him just to drive the point home. Proximity has taught me some basic and humbling truths, including this vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst thing that we've done. My work with the poor and the incarcerated has persuaded me that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. Finally, I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, the character of our society, our commitment to the rule of law, fairness, and equality cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged, and respected among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. Sounds a little bit like the Sermon on the Mount to me. And then second and lastly, he used his proximity to evil, suffering, and injustice to birth love and mercy, just like we see in the life of Jesus. And while you can clearly see this in the reality of his work that he and EGI are embarking on a daily basis, I personally was moved emotionally and saw this aspect of his character most clearly through a story he tells in his book about his interactions with a prisoner guard that left me in tears. So I hope I do it justice by recounting it here with you to close. While Bryan was so accustomed to walking through prison yards as a lawyer, he starts off one story by mentioning a particular walk through a prison yard because he couldn't help but notice a truck parked outside. And what caught his eye was that this truck was covered in provocative stickers of racially oppressive symbols. Frazzled by the signs of hate and unwelcome on the truck, he entered the visitation area of the prison. And while he was familiar with the etiquette of communicating with prison guards, this particular white prison guard he faced in this instance was different. "You have to be searched first," said the guard, which isn't necessary for lawyers to do. "You're going to go into that bathroom and take off everything if you expect to get in my prison." And Bryan replied, "No, sir, I think you might have me confused. I'm an attorney. Lawyers don't have to get strip searched to come in for legal visits." But the story continues where the prison guard makes Bryan go through the humiliation of a full strip search as if he is the criminal in order for him to visit his client, which was wrong and dehumanizing and downright humiliating. But Bryan bore that suffering for his client. For Bryan, on his way out of that strip search area, the prison guard shouts to Bryan, "Hey man, did you happen to see a truck out there in the lot with a lot of bumper stickers and a flag and a gun rack?" Bryan replied cautiously, "Yes." The guard said, "I want you to know that's my truck." And in that moment, Bryan mentions the valid feelings of anger and disgust. He explains that there was more than really anger at this guard. He was more irritated at his own sense of powerlessness. Can you imagine that? Can you put yourself in his shoes? There's nothing he can really do about it. It's wrong, it's immoral, and he's powerless. The story goes on by explaining that the same correctional officer was present throughout the defense of this particular client. And actually, in a sheer mark of grace, they encountered one another again at some time later at the same visitation center. But this time it was very different. In this next encounter, the white prison guard's demeanor was quite different, outright nervous, as he helped Bryan once again visit this client. The guard says, I took your client Avery to court for his hearing, and I was down there with you all for those 3 days. And I want you to know that I was listening. I actually appreciate what you're doing. I really do. It was kind of difficult for me to be in that courtroom to hear what you all were talking about. See, I came up in foster care too, you know. And I didn't think anyone had it as bad as me, that they moved me around like I wasn't wanted nowhere. I had it pretty rough. But listening to what you were saying about Avery, this client of Bryan's, made me realize that there are other people who had it as bad as I did. I guess even worse. I mean, it brought back a lot of memories sitting in that courtroom. And the prison guard continued to share about his current problems and traumas, and finally asks Bryan, you know that expert doctor that you put up in court who said that some of the damage that's done to kids in these abusive homes is permanent? Kind of made me worried. Do you think that's true? To which Bryan says this, oh, I think we can always do better. The bad things that happen to us don't define us. It's just important sometimes that people know where we're coming from. Now, I can imagine in that moment someone who humiliated him, dehumanized him, and now full circle, he's looking at this wounded white prison guard saying, hey, I get it. Now, to me, that's a story of taking on evil and birthing mercy and love. Like Bryan and like Jesus, may we go and do the same, remembering that each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done.